In the sleepy village of Chipping Barnet, a secretive widow hides behind perpetually drawn curtains, her past shrouded in whispers of a sudden death and unpaid debts. When a mysterious stranger slips into her cottage under cover of night, Miss Jane Marple's keen eye for human nature unravels a chilling tale of blackmail, betrayal, and a truth long buried in the shadows of Linden Lane. Chapter 1. The House on Linden Lane. The village of Chipping Barnet, tucked into a gentle fold of the English countryside, wore its charm with the quiet confidence of a place untouched by the clamor of modernity. Its cobbled lanes, lined with thatched cottages and rose-draped fences, whispered of simpler times, and its inhabitants moved with the unhurried rhythm of those who knew their neighbors' habits as well as their own. Yet, at the end of Linden Lane, where the road curved past an ancient oak, stood a cottage that seemed to defy the village's open-hearted nature. Its windows, shrouded in heavy damask curtains, never parted to welcome the morning sun, and its garden, though meticulously tended, bore an air of secrecy. This was the home of Mrs. Evelyn Harrow, a widow who had become as much a fixture of local lore as the church spire or the old mill. Miss Jane Marple lately arrived to spend a fortnight with her nephew. Raymond West and his wife, Joan, found herself intrigued by this anomaly. She sat in the airy drawing-room of Raymond's modern bungalow, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale pink shawl. The room, with its wide windows and tasteful furnishings, offered a view of the village green, where children played and villagers exchanged pleasantries. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, drawn inexorably to the cottage on Linden Lane. "It's rather peculiar, Raymond," she remarked, her voice soft but laced with a curiosity that belied her gentle demeanor. "That house at the end of the lane, Mrs. Harrow's, I believe you said. Those curtains are always drawn, day and night. One wonders what prompts such determined seclusion." Raymond, sprawled in an armchair with a manuscript in hand, looked up with a chuckle. A writer of some repute, he had a tendency to dismiss his observations as the fancies of an idle mind. "Aunt Jane, you're weaving mysteries out of nothing. Perhaps Mrs. Harrow simply prefers the dark. Or she's eccentric, plenty of widows are, you know." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, twinkled with amusement. "Eccentricity is a convenient word, my dear, but it often masks something deeper. In my experience, those who shut out the world have reasons they'd rather not share. I knew a woman once, in my own village, who kept her blinds down for years after a scandal. It wasn't eccentricity, but fear of prying eyes." Joan, entering with a tray of tea, caught the tail end of the conversation and smiled. "You're incorrigible. Aunt Jane? Mrs. Harrow's probably just grieving. Her husband died, 10 years ago? Some people never recover." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea, her fingers delicate on the china. "Grief, yes," she murmured, "but 10 years is a long time to mourn in darkness. There's something more, I think. Something unresolved." Her words hung in the air, and Raymond, sensing the futility of arguing, returned to his manuscript. But Miss Marple's mind was already at work, sifting through the fragments of what she'd heard about Mrs. Harrow. The widow was a figure of fascination in Chipping Barnet, spoken of in hushed tones at the butcher's or the post office. She was said to be in her late 40s, though no one could claim to have seen her clearly in years. Her maid, a young woman named Nancy, handled all her dealings with the outside world, from fetching groceries to collecting prescriptions. The cottage itself was a paradox, its exterior pristine, its roses blooming with almost defiant vigor, yet its windows sealed against the light. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to take a walk, her stout shoes tapping lightly on the cobbled path. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. She made her way toward Linden Lane, her pace leisurely but her eyes sharp, taking in every detail, the sparrows flitting in the hedgerows, the postman's bicycle leaning against a gate, the faint hum of life in the village. As she approached Mrs. Harrow's cottage, she slowed, her gaze settling on the drawn curtains. The house was silent, its chimneys smokeless, yet there was a sense of watchfulness about it, as if it were holding its breath. She paused by the low stone wall that bordered the garden, noting the precision of the clipped boxwood and the absence of weeds. Someone takes great care here, she thought, but for whose benefit? As she stood, a faint movement caught her eye, a twitch of the curtain in the downstairs window, so slight it might have been the breeze. But there was no breeze, and Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Was it Mrs. Harrow, peering out? Or perhaps Nancy, guarding her mistress's privacy? She lingered a moment longer, then turned back toward Raymond's bungalow, her mind buzzing with questions. The cottage on Linden Lane was more than a curiosity. It was a riddle, and Miss Marple had never been able to resist a riddle. As she walked, she recalled a spinster in her youth, a Miss Gwendolen Price, who had lived in a similar state of seclusion after a broken engagement. The village had called her odd, but Miss Marple had seen the truth, a secret buried deep that had shaped her solitude. People are much the same everywhere, she mused, and secrets have a way of making themselves known. By the time she reached the bungalow, her resolve was firm. She would learn more about Mrs. Evelyn Harrow, her unseen life, and the shadows that kept her curtains closed. For in Chipping Barnet, as in any village, the surface of things was rarely the whole story. Chapter 2. The Village Gossip. The tea-room of Chipping Barnet, a quaint establishment known as the Copper Kettle, was the beating heart of village gossip. Its lace-curtained windows and polished oak tables invited confidences, and its patrons, armed with teacups and opinions, wove the fabric of local lore with every murmured word. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a corner table with a pot of Earl Grey and a plate of scones, found it the perfect vantage point to observe the rhythms of the village. Her knitting lay in her lap, a soft tangle of pale pink wool, but her hands were still, her attention wholly absorbed by the conversation at the next table, where Mrs. Pemberley, the baker's wife, held court with Miss Clara Tuttle, the postmistress, and Mrs. Agnes Cole, who ran the village haberdashery. Miss Marple's presence was unobtrusive, her gentle smile and unassuming air rendering her almost invisible to those who did not know her. Yet her ears, sharp as ever, caught every nuance of the discussion, which had inevitably turned to the enigma of Linden Lane. Mrs. Pemberley, a stout woman with a penchant for dramatic pauses, leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. 10 years, Clara, and not a glimpse of her. Not at church, not at the market, not even at the summer fete. It's unnatural, if you ask me. Miss Tuttle, whose thin frame and pinched lips suggested a lifetime of disapproval, nodded vigorously. Unnatural is the word. Nancy fetches everything: groceries, letters, even the doctor when she's poorly. I've seen her post-bag, mind you. Bills mostly, but no personal letters. Not a one. Mrs. Cole, whose fingers fidgeted with the hem of her apron, added, I heard she sends Nancy to the chemist in Haversham for her medicines. Doesn't trust our Mr. Dobbs, apparently, though what she's taking medicines for, nobody knows. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was cataloguing every detail. She had learned, over many years of observing human nature, that gossip, while often embroidered, held kernels of truth. The trick was to sift through the embellishments to find them. Mrs. Harrow must be a very private person, she ventured, her voice soft but clear enough to carry. It's not uncommon, I suppose, for a widow to keep to herself after such a loss. Mrs. Pemberley turned, her eyes gleaming with the delight of a fresh audience. Private? That's putting it kindly, Miss Marple. She's a hermit, plain and simple. Why, when Mr. Harrow was alive, she was quite the lady tease, garden parties, always dressed so fine. But after he passed, it was as if she locked herself away with her grief. Or something else, Miss Tuttle added darkly, her teaspoon clinking against her saucer. There were stories, you know, about her and Mr. Harrow. Not that I hold with gossip, but people did talk. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, but it was an invitation to continue. "Stories?" she asked, her tone one of mild curiosity. "What sort of stories?" Mrs. Pemberley hesitated, glancing at her companions as if weighing the propriety of sharing. But the lure of revelation was too strong. "Well," she began, lowering her voice further, "some said she wasn't as fond of him as she let on. Oh, she played the devoted wife, but there were whispers, little things. Coldness, you might say. They'd be at a dinner, and she'd barely speak to him, or so Mrs. Langley told me, and she was their neighbor back then." "Mrs. Langley?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet clicking, a rhythm that seemed to steady the conversation. "Did she know the Harrows well?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Cole piped up. "She and her husband, Mr. Langley, lived next door to them before he moved to London. She said Mr. Harrow was charming, always full of plans, business ventures, investments, that sort of thing. But Mrs. Harrow, she was different. Reserved, like she was holding something back." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to a woman she had known in her youth, a vicar's sister who had worn a mask of propriety to conceal a private sorrow. "And Mr. Harrow's death?" she asked gently. "I understand it was sudden." "Sudden as a thunderclap," Mrs. Pemberley said, her voice tinged with relish. "Found him in the garden, stone dead. Heart attack, Dr. Grayson said. Only 50, poor man. Fit as a fiddle, or so everyone thought. Mrs. Harrow was beside herself, they say, but she shut herself up soon after. Never seen at the funeral, even. Nancy handled everything." Miss Tuttle leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "And that's another thing. Nancy's loyal as a dog, but she's jumpy. I tried asking her once, just a friendly question about her mistress, and she near dropped the postbag. Sighed Mrs. Harrow doesn't like questions. Well, if you ask me, that's not just grief." Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. "Loyalty can be a heavy burden," she murmured, her mind turning over the pieces of this puzzle. A widow who hid from the world, a maid who guarded her secrets, a husband whose death had been abrupt. There was a pattern here, though its shape was not yet clear. She thought of a case in her own village, years ago, where a young wife had withdrawn after her husband's death, only for it to emerge that she had known more about his demise than she admitted. "People are so very complicated," she said aloud, almost to herself. Mrs. Pemberley, mistaking this for a prompt, pressed on. "Complicated indeed. And then there's the matter of the money. Mr. Harrow was well off, or so everyone thought, but after he died, there was talk of debts. Mr. Langley, Mrs. Langley's husband, that is, said Harrow, owed him a tidy sum. Never paid, of course. Langley was furious, went to London in a huff." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes sharpening. "Debts?" she asked, her voice as mild as ever. "That must have caused some ill feeling." "Oh, it did," Mrs. Cole said eagerly. "Mr. Langley came back once or twice, banging on her door, but Nancy turned him away. Said Mrs. Harrow wasn't seeing anyone. I reckon he gave up in the end." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind already weaving connections. A debt, a sudden death, a widow's seclusion, each was a thread, and she sensed they were part of a larger tapestry. She sipped her tea, letting the conversation drift to other matters, the price of flour, the vicar's new sermon, but her thoughts remained fixed on Mrs. Harrow. The tea room, with its clatter of cups and hum of voices, faded into the background as she considered the nature of secrets. In her experience, those who hid most fiercely were often protecting more than their grief. Was Mrs. Harrow shielding a broken heart, or something far less innocent? As she rose to leave, thanking her companions with her usual courtesy, Miss Marple glanced out the window toward Linden Lane. The cottage was out of sight, but she could picture it clearly, its drawn curtains, its silent watchfulness. "There's a story behind those curtains," she thought, "and I mean to find out what it is." Stepping into the crisp autumn air, she adjusted her hat and set off toward Raymond's bungalow, her step light but purposeful. The village of Chipping Barnet might seem sleepy, but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath its placid surface, currents of truth were stirring, and she had every intention of following them to their source. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Visitor. A soft glow of evening settled over Chipping Barnet, casting long shadows across the village green and bathing the cobbled lanes in a gentle twilight. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the cozy sitting room of her nephew Raymond's bungalow, was absorbed in her knitting, the rhythmic click of her needles blending with the crackle of the fire. Yet her thoughts were far from the pale pink shawl taking shape in her hands. They lingered on the cottage at the end of Linden Lane, its drawn curtains a silent challenge to her curiosity. The village gossip from the copper kettle had only deepened her interest, and she found herself turning over the fragments of Mrs. Harrow's story like pieces of a half-finished jigsaw. Raymond, sprawled across a sofa with a novel, broke the silence with a yawn. "You're awfully quiet, Aunt Jane? Still dreaming up mysteries about that widow? Joan says you'll have her pegged as a master criminal by the end of the week." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Not quite, my dear. But I do find Mrs. Harrow's seclusion intriguing. People don't shut themselves away for no reason. There's always a cause, even if it's buried deep." Before Raymond could reply, Joan entered, her face alight with news. "Aunt Jane, you'll never guess what I heard at the butcher's this afternoon. A stranger was seen near Linden Lane last night, a man, quite tall, in a dark coat. Mr. Gibbs, the butcher, said he was lingering near Mrs. Harrow's cottage, looking all furtive. What do you make of that?" Raymond laughed, tossing his book aside. "Probably a delivery man who got lost. Honestly, you two are determined to turn Chipping Barnet into a den of intrigue." Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps, Raymond, but it's curious all the same. A stranger, at dusk, near a house that never welcomes visitors? I wonder." Her words trailed off, but her mind was already at work, weaving possibilities. She recalled a case from years past when a mysterious visitor to a quiet village had turned out to be a debt collector with a grudge. Could this man be connected to the whispers of Mr. Harrow's unpaid debts? Or was he something else entirely, a relative, perhaps, or a figure from Mrs. Harrow's hidden past? Determined to learn more, Miss Marple resolved to take matters into her own hands. The following evening, after a light supper, she announced her intention to take a short walk. "The air will do me good," she said, slipping on her coat and adjusting her hat with a precision that belied her casual tone. Raymond, engrossed in his writing, merely nodded, but Joan shot her a knowing look. "Don't go sleuthing too hard, Aunt Jane," she teased. "We don't want you tangled up in any mysteries." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Just a stroll, my dear." Nothing more. Her steps led her, as if by instinct, toward the churchyard, a quiet spot that offered a discreet view of Linden Lane. The church, with its ancient stone walls and weathered gravestones, was bathed in the soft light of a rising moon. Miss Marple settled herself on a bench near the lych gate, her black shawl blending into the shadows. From here, she could see the silhouette of Mrs. Harrow's cottage, its curtains as impenetrable as ever. She waited, her patience honed by years of observation, her senses attuned to the smallest disturbance. The village was quiet, save for the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Then, as the church clock struck 8, a figure appeared at the end of Linden Lane. He was tall, as Joan had described, his dark coat blending into the twilight. His movements were cautious, his head turning to scan the empty lane before he approached the cottage. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as he paused at the gate, his posture tense, as if weighing a decision. Then, with a quick glance over his shoulder, he moved to the door and knocked softly 3 sharp raps, deliberate and measured. To her astonishment, the door opened almost at once, though only a crack. The light from within was dim, casting no clear view of the figure inside, but Miss Marple caught the low murmur of voices, A man's, urgent and clipped, and a woman's, softer, tinged with hesitation. The exchange was brief, no more than a minute, before the man slipped inside, the door closing silently behind him. Miss Marple sat very still, her mind racing. Who was this man, and why had Mrs. Harrow, or perhaps Nancy, allowed him entry? In a house that shunned all visitors, this was no small event. She thought of the village gossip, the hints of debts and discord, and wondered if this stranger might be the Mr. Langley mentioned at the tea-room, the man who had quarreled with Mr. Harrow over money. Or perhaps he was someone else entirely, a piece of the puzzle yet to be named. She lingered a while longer, but the cottage remained silent, its curtains unmoved. At last she rose, her joints protesting faintly, and made her way back to Raymond's bungalow. The night air was cool, and as she walked, she turned over the possibilities. A visitor at such an hour, she mused, and admitted so quickly. That suggests familiarity, or perhaps necessity. But what kind of necessity? The next morning, over breakfast, Miss Marple learned from Joan that the stranger had been seen again, this time boarding the early train to London. Miss Tuttle was at the station, Joan said, buttering her toast. She said he looked like a city man's sharp suit under that coat, and a manner about him. Not one of us, she said. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her thoughts far from calm. Not one of us, she repeated softly. That's very interesting, Joan. Very interesting indeed. She sipped her tea, her mind already piecing together the fragments of this mystery. A secretive widow, a village full of whispers, and now a mysterious visitor who came and went under cover of darkness. Each was a clue, a thread in the tapestry she was determined to unravel. As she set her cup down, her eyes gleamed with the quiet resolve of one who knew that even the most carefully guarded secrets could not stay hidden forever. Chapter 4. The Maid's Tale. The morning sun cast a golden glow over Chipping Barnet, gilding the rooftops and lending a deceptive warmth to the autumn air. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, sat at the breakfast table in her nephew's bungalow, her thoughts as sharp as the butter knife she wielded with precision. The mysterious visitor to Mrs. Harrow's cottage weighed heavily on her mind, his fleeting presence a tantalizing clue in the enigma of Linden Lane. She had learned from Joan that the man had departed on the early train to London, but his purpose and his identity remained elusive. Miss Marple knew that to unravel this puzzle, she needed to penetrate the silent fortress of the cottage, and the key to that fortress, she suspected, was Nancy, the maid. Nancy was a figure almost as shadowy as her mistress, known to the villagers as a quiet, skittish girl who flitted through Chipping Barnet on errands, her eyes downcast and her answers brief. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beyond the surface, sensed that Nancy's reticence was not mere shyness, but a guardrail around secrets she was bound to protect. To speak with her, Miss Marple knew, would require tact, a gentle approach that disarmed without alarming. Thus, after breakfast, Miss Marple set out for the village shop, a bustling little establishment where the grocer, Mr. Dobbs, presided over shelves of tinned goods and fresh produce. She timed her visit for mid-morning, when Nancy was likely to appear for Mrs. Harrow's provisions. Sure enough, as Miss Marple lingered over a display of jams, she spotted the girl entering, a wicker basket on her arm and a list clutched in her hand. Nancy was plain, with mousy hair tucked under a modest bonnet and a face that might have been pretty, if not for its perpetual air of anxiety. Miss Marple approached with the ease of long practice, her smile warm and her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "Good morning, my dear," she said, holding up a jar of gooseberry jam. "I was just wondering if this might be too tart for my nephew's taste. You look like someone with a good eye for such things. Do you think it would suit?" Nancy started, her eyes darting to Miss Marple, before softening slightly. "Oh, I don't know, miss," she stammered, her fingers tightening on the basket. "I suppose it depends on if he likes sharp flavors." "A wise observation," Miss Marple replied, setting the jar down and turning her full attention to the girl. "You must have quite a knack for managing a household, looking after Mrs. Harrow as you do. It can't be easy, with her keeping so much to herself." Nancy's cheeks flushed, and she busied herself with selecting a loaf of bread. "She's good to me, miss," she said quickly. "Keeps to herself, yes, but she's kind." "I don't mind." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle understanding. "Of course, my dear. It's a fine thing to have such loyalty. Though I imagine it must be lonely at times, in that quiet house. Does Mrs. Harrow ever have visitors to liven things up?" The question was asked with such casual warmth that it might have been mistaken for idle chatter, but Miss Marple's eyes were keen, noting the sudden tension in Nancy's shoulders. The girl hesitated, her fingers fumbling with the loaf. "Not often, miss," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "She likes her privacy. Doesn't care for company. Not even old friends?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone as light as ever. "I heard a gentleman was seen near the cottage the other evening. A tall man in a dark coat. Perhaps someone from her past?" Nancy's face paled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might drop the basket. I don't know anything about that," she said, her words tumbling out too quickly. "I mean, no one came, not that I saw. I've got to finish these errands, miss, if you'll excuse me." With that, she hurried to the counter, leaving Miss Marple to contemplate the encounter. The girl's nervousness was palpable, her denial too emphatic to be entirely truthful. Miss Marple paid for her jam, her mind turning over the exchange like a jeweler examining a flawed gem. Nancy's loyalty was clear, but so was her fear of fear that suggested she knew more than she was willing to share. As she stepped out into the village street, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of loyalty. She recalled a young parlour-maid from her own village, years ago, who had shielded her employer's secrets out of devotion, only to realize too late that her silence had protected a wrongdoer. Loyalty can be a trap, she mused, especially when it's born of fear rather than love. Back at Raymond's bungalow, she found her nephew in the garden, pruning roses with more enthusiasm than skill. "Aunt Jane," he called, waving a pair of shears, "you're back early. Find any clues in the jam aisle?" Miss Marple smiled, settling onto a garden bench. "Not clues, perhaps, but insights. That young maid, Nancy, she's fiercely loyal to Mrs. Harrow, but there's something troubling her. I mentioned the visitor, and she all but fled." Raymond grinned, wiping his brow. "You're reading too much into it, as usual. She's probably just shy. Not everyone's hiding a dark secret, you know." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple conceded, her eyes twinkling. "But in my experience, those who guard their words so carefully are often guarding something else. I shall have to be patient, I think." That evening, as she sat by the fire, her knitting once more in hand, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Nancy. The girl was the gatekeeper to Mrs. Harrow's world, and her unease was a crack in the cottage's impenetrable facade. Miss Marple knew that such cracks, however small, could lead to the truth if only one knew where to press. For now, she would watch and wait, certain that the mystery of Linden Lane was beginning to unravel, thread by delicate thread. Chapter 5. The Shadow of the Past. The soft patter of rain against the windows of Raymond West's bungalow lent a cozy intimacy to the evening. As Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a familiar comfort in her hands, the pale pink shawl was growing steadily, its neat rows a testament to her patience, a quality she now applied to the puzzle of Mrs. Evelyn. Harrow and her secluded cottage on Linden Lane, the mysterious visitor, Nancy's nervous reticence, and the village's whispers of debts and discord had woven a web of intrigue that Miss Marple was determined to untangle. Each clue, however small, was a stitch in the pattern, and she sensed that the past held the key to the present mystery. Her opportunity to delve deeper came unexpectedly, when Raymond announced that the vicar, Mr. Denham, would be joining them for dinner. "A good sort," Raymond said, adjusting his tie in the hall mirror. Bit long-winded on sermons, but he's been here forever knows everyone's history. You'll like him, Aunt Jane. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I'm sure I shall, my dear. A vicar often sees more of a village's heart than anyone else. Mr. Denham arrived promptly at 7. A wiry man in his 60s with a kindly face and a habit of rubbing his hands together as if warming them for a task. Over a simple meal of roast lamb and minted peas, the conversation flowed easily, touching on village affairs, the upcoming harvest festival, and Raymond's latest literary endeavors. But Miss Marple, with her gentle skill, steered the talk toward Linden Lane, her questions as delicate as the lace doily beneath her plate. Mrs. Harrow's cottage is quite charming, she remarked, passing the gravy, though I understand she keeps very much to herself. Was she always so reserved, Mr. Denham? The vicar paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, and his expression grew thoughtful. Not at all, Miss Marple. When Evelyn Harrow first came to Chipping Barnet with her husband, they were a lively pair. She was quite the hostess tease, card parties, even a small musicale now and then. Charming woman, full of grace. But after poor Harrow's death, well, she changed. Shut herself away completely. I've not seen her in church these 10 years. Miss Marple nodded, her face a picture of sympathetic interest. Such a tragedy to lose a husband so suddenly. A heart attack, I believe? It must have been a terrible shock. Oh, it was, Mr. Denham agreed, his hands rubbing together briskly. Found him in the garden, just beyond the rose beds. Dr. Grayson said it was his heart quick and merciful, at least. But Evelyn took it hard. She was devoted to him, or so it seemed to those of us who saw them together. Miss Marple's needles, resting in her lap, seemed to pause of their own accord. Seemed? She asked, her voice soft, but edged with curiosity. Was there ever any suggestion otherwise? Mr. Denham hesitated, glancing at Raymond, who was engrossed in his meal, and Joan, who was refilling the water jug. Well, he said at last, lowering his voice. There were whispers, as there always are in a village. Nothing concrete, mind you, but some folk thought Evelyn was distant even before his death. She'd smile and play the perfect wife, but there was a coolness, they said. And then there was the business with Mr. Langley. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained mild. Mr. Langley? The gentleman who lived next door, I believe? Exactly so, the vicar replied, warming to his tale. A business partner of Harrow's, from what I gathered. They had some venture together, imports, I think, though I'm no man for commerce. Langley claimed Harrow owed him a considerable sum, something to do with a failed deal. There was quite a to-do after Harrow's death. Langley came round, demanding payment, but Evelyn, or rather, Nancy turned him away. He left for London soon after, and I don't believe he's been back since. Miss Marple sipped her water, her mind racing. The name Langley had surfaced again, a thread connecting the past to the mysterious visitor she had seen. And this Mr. Langley, she said carefully, was he the sort to hold a grudge? Mr. Denham frowned, considering. I'd say so. He was a hard man, not unkind but sharp, with a temper when crossed. I remember him at the funeral, standing apart, his face like thunder. He didn't speak to Evelyn, though I saw him watching her. Then he was gone, and the matter seemed to die with him. Joan, returning to the table, caught the tail end of the conversation. How sad, she said, her voice soft. To lose a husband, and then face such unpleasantness. No wonder she keeps those curtains closed. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, her thoughts elsewhere. She recalled a similar case in her own village, where a widow's seclusion had masked not grief but guilt, tied to a financial dispute that had ended in tragedy. Debts can cast long shadows, she said aloud, almost to herself. And those shadows often linger in unexpected places. After dinner, as Mr. Denham took his leave, Miss Marple lingered by the window, gazing out toward the darkened silhouette of Linden Lane. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. The vicar's words had added new depth to the mystery. A husband whose death was sudden but unquestioned, a wife whose devotion was doubted, a business partner with a grievance. And now, the possibility that this Langley, or someone like him, had returned to Chipping Barnet, slipping into the cottage under cover of night. She returned to her knitting, her fingers moving with practiced ease, but her mind was far from idle. A shadow from the past, she mused, and a visitor in the present. There's a connection here, I'm sure of it. She thought of the man in the dark coat, his cautious knock, and the door that had opened to admit him. Was he Langley, seeking to revive an old quarrel? Or was he someone else, tied to Mrs. Harrow by a bond the village could not guess? As the fire crackled and Raymond's typewriter clattered in the next room, Miss Marple's resolve hardened. She would need to tread carefully, for the truth, like the cottage on Linden Lane, was shrouded in layers that would not easily part. But part they would, she was certain, for secrets, however well guarded, had a way of betraying themselves to those who knew how to look. Chapter 6. The Unseen Evidence. The drizzle that had softened Chipping Barnet's lanes the previous evening gave way to a crisp, clear morning, with sunlight filtering through the bare branches of the elms. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a cup of tea and a slice of Joan's excellent seed cake, felt a quiet determination stirring within her. The mystery of Mrs. Evelyn Harrow's cottage on Linden Lane was growing more intricate with each passing day. The visitor in the dark coat, the whispers of debts owed to Mr. Langley, and Nancy's palpable unease were all pieces of a puzzle that refused to snap neatly into place. Yet Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay in the smallest details, overlooked by those less accustomed to looking. Her morning walk, ostensibly for the benefit of her health, took her once more past the cottage on Linden Lane. The house stood as silent and inscrutable as ever, its curtains drawn tight against the world. But Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite her years, were drawn to the garden where the roses, now fading with the season, stood in orderly rows. She paused at the low stone wall, her gloved hands resting lightly on its mossy surface, and considered her next move. The village gossip and the vicar's revelations had given her much to ponder, but she needed something tangible, a clue that might bridge the gap between rumor and reality. It was then that she decided on a bolder course. Under the pretext of delivering a leaflet for the church's upcoming harvest festival, she approached the cottage's front door, her step as brisk as her resolve. The leaflet, neatly folded in her handbag, was a flimsy excuse, but Miss Marple had long ago learned that the simplest pretexts often opened the most guarded doors. She knocked gently, her ears attuned to any sound from within. The door opened a fraction, revealing Nancy's pale, anxious face. "Yes, miss?" The maid said, her voice tight, her eyes darting past Miss Marple as if expecting an ambush. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said, her smile as warm as a summer afternoon. "I've brought a leaflet for the Harvest Festival. Thought Mrs. Harrow might like to know about it. Such a lovely event, don't you think?" Nancy's fingers gripped the doorframe, her knuckles whitening. "Mrs. Harrow isn't receiving visitors, miss," she said quickly. "But I'll take the leaflet for her, thank you." Miss Marple handed it over, her gaze slipping past Nancy into the dim hallway. The interior was tidy, almost austere, with a polished floor and a single photograph framed on the wall. The image caught her attention, a man and a woman, smiling in a garden, but the man was not the broad-shouldered, ruddy-faced Mr. Harrow described by the villagers. This man was leaner, with a sharp jaw and a city air about him. Before she could study it further, Nancy shifted, blocking her view. "Thank you, miss," Nancy said, her tone final, and the door began to close. Miss Marple stepped back, her expression serene but her mind alight. "Of course, my dear. Do give Mrs. Harrow my regards." As she turned away, her eyes swept the garden once more, and a glint in the soil near the rose beds caught her attention. She bent down, feigning a stumble, and retrieved a small, broken spectacle lens, half buried in the earth. It was scratched and clouded, but its presence was curious. She slipped it into her pocket, her heart quickening with the thrill of discovery. Back at Raymond's bungalow, she examined the lens under a magnifying glass borrowed from her nephew's desk. An old prescription, she murmured, turning it in the light. Not the sort a man like Mr. Harrow would have needed, if the talk of his robust health is true. And why here, in the garden where he died? Raymond, passing through with a stack of manuscripts, caught her muttering and grinned. "Aunt Jane, are you sleuthing again? What's that a clue to the great Linden Lane conspiracy?" Miss Marple chuckled, tucking the lens away. "Just a bit of broken glass, my dear. But it's surprising what such things can tell you, if you know how to listen." That evening, as she sat by the fire, her knitting neglected in her lap, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the photograph in the hallway. The man in it was not Mr. Harrow, she was certain, and yet it hung in a place of prominence. Was he the mysterious visitor, perhaps? Or someone else from Mrs. Harrow's past, a figure tied to the debts and whispers that lingered like shadows around her name? And the lens, could it belong to the same man, dropped in a moment of haste or confrontation? She recalled a case from her youth, when a broken watch found in a vicarage garden had pointed to a thief's midnight escape. Small things, she thought, can speak loudly if you give them a voice. The lens, like the photograph, was a fragment of evidence, unseen by others but heavy with possibility. Had it been dropped recently by the man in the dark coat? Or had it lain there for years, a relic of the day Mr. Harrow collapsed in that very garden? Miss Marple's mind turned to the rumors of Mr. Harrow's debts and the quarrel with Mr. Langley. If Langley had been in the garden that fateful day, arguing over money, might he have left something behind, something like a spectacle lens? And if so, why had Mrs. Harrow or Nancy not cleared it away? The questions multiplied, each one a thread in the intricate tapestry she was weaving. As the clock struck 9, she set her knitting aside and rose, her resolve firm. The cottage on Linden Lane was a locked box, but she had found a crack in its defenses. The lens and the photograph were clues, small but significant, and she would follow them wherever they led. For now, she would keep her discovery to herself, knowing that the truth, like a shy creature, often emerged only when least expected. Chapter 7. The Truth Unveiled. The pale light of an autumn morning filtered through the lace curtains of Raymond West's bungalow, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor. Miss Jane Marple sat at the breakfast table, her tea cooling as she turned the broken spectacle lens over in her mind. The photograph in Mrs. Harrow's hallway, the whispered debts of her late husband, and the mysterious visitor who had slipped into the cottage under cover of dusk, were all threads in a tapestry that was now taking shape. Yet the pattern remained elusive, and Miss Marple knew that to unravel the mystery of Linden Lane, she would need to venture beyond the village's confines. Her thoughts were interrupted by Raymond, who entered with a letter in hand. "Aunt Jane, you look positively conspiratorial," he teased, tossing the letter onto the table. "What's brewing in that detective mind of yours? Another clue from the jam aisle?" Miss Marple's lips twitched into a smile. "Not quite, my dear, but I've been thinking about Mrs. Harrow and her visitor. There's a connection to the past, I'm sure of it, and I believe it lies in London." "London?" Joan, setting a plate of toast on the table, raised an eyebrow. "You're not planning a trip, are you?" "You've only been here a week." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A short visit, perhaps. I have an old friend there, Inspector Craddock, who might help shed light on certain matters. A name from Mrs. Harrow's past has come up, Mr. Langley, and I'd like to know more about him." Raymond groaned, though his grin betrayed his amusement. "You're incorrigible, Aunt Jane. Next, you'll have us all chasing ghosts across the city." But Miss Marple was already resolved. That afternoon, she took the train to London, her modest suitcase packed with little more than her knitting and a notebook. Inspector Craddock, now retired but still sharp as a tack, met her at a quiet tea shop near Victoria Station. Over scones and a pot of Darjeeling, she laid out the pieces of the puzzle: the widow's seclusion, the mysterious visitor, the spectacle lens, and the rumors of unpaid debts. Craddock listened, his brow furrowing. "Langley, you say? The name rings a bell. I'll make some inquiries. If he's the sort to hold a grudge, he might well have resurfaced after all these years." By the next day, Craddock had news. He joined Miss Marple at the tea shop, his notebook open. "Reginald Langley," he said, tapping a page. "A businessman, imports and exports, mostly. Not exactly a saint known for sharp dealings and a temper. He and Harrow were partners in a venture that went sour, left Langley out of pocket to the tune of several £1,000s. After Harrow's death, Langley tried to claim the money from the estate, but Mrs. Harrow's solicitor shut him down. He's been in London ever since, but word is he's fallen on hard times. And here's the kicker: he was spotted in Chipping Barnet last week." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Last week? That fits with the visitor I saw. And the spectacle lens, could it be his?" Craddock shrugged. "Possibly. I can check if he wears glasses, but it's a long shot. The question is, why go back now, after 10 years? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. Blackmail, perhaps. If Langley believed Mrs. Harrow knew something about her husband's death or had a hand in it, he might be pressing her for money to keep quiet. Craddock leaned back, his expression grim. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Marple. You think she had something to do with Harrow's death?" "Not necessarily," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "But I've seen cases where a woman, desperate or deceived, might act against her better judgment. Suppose Langley convinced her to give her husband something. A sedative, perhaps, that turned out to be more dangerous than she knew." Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "I'll dig deeper into Langley's movements. If he's been to Chipping Barnet, someone must have seen him." Back in the village, Miss Marple wasted no time. She sought out Nancy once more, this time at the church, where the girl was delivering a basket of apples for the harvest festival. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentleness, her eyes kind but unyielding. "Nancy, my dear," she said, helping to arrange the apples, "I know you're loyal to Mrs. Harrow, and that's admirable, but I've learned something troubling about a man named Langley. He visited the cottage, didn't he?" Nancy's hands froze, her face paling. I don't know what you mean, miss," she stammered, but her eyes betrayed her. Miss Marple's voice was low, almost confiding. "You don't have to protect her, my dear. Not if she's in trouble. That man, he's been threatening her, hasn't he? About something that happened long ago?" Nancy's resolve crumbled, tears welling in her eyes. "He came a few times," she whispered. "Said he'd tell everyone Mrs. Harrow helped him years ago. She didn't mean to hurt Mr. Harrow. She thought it was just medicine, to calm him, but it killed him. She's been paying Langley ever since to keep quiet. She's so ashamed, miss." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the girl's arm. "You've done right to tell me, Nancy. Blackmail is a cruel thing, and it's time it stopped." With Craddock's help, Langley was traced to a shabby boarding house in London. Confronted with evidence of his visits to Chipping Barnet and Nancy's testimony, he confessed to blackmailing Mrs. Harrow, claiming she had given her husband a fatal dose of poison under the guise of a sedative. At his urging, Mrs. Harrow, summoned to the vicarage under the pretense of a charitable meeting, broke down when faced with the truth. Her seclusion, she admitted, was not just grief but guilt, a self-imposed penance for a crime she had not fully understood until it was too late. As Miss Marple watched Nancy lead her mistress away, her heart was heavy, but her mind clear. The truth had emerged, as it always did, and though it brought pain, it also brought release. The cottage on Linden Lane would soon tell a different story. She hoped one of healing, rather than hiding. Chapter 8. The Curtains Open. The soft hush of late autumn had settled over Chipping Barnet. The village lanes dappled with fallen leaves, and the air sharp with the promise of winter. Miss Jane Marple, her visit to her nephew Raymond nearing its end, stood once more before the cottage on Linden Lane, her eyes fixed on a sight that had been unthinkable only days before. The heavy damask curtains were drawn back, revealing the window's clear panes and, beyond them, the faint outline of a woman standing alone. Mrs. Evelyn Harrow, pale and fragile, gazed out at the world she had shunned for a decade, her face a map of sorrow, but also, perhaps, a glimmer of resolve. The sight stirred something in Miss Marple, a quiet satisfaction, tempered by the ache of understanding human frailty. The events of the past days had unfolded with the inevitability of a well-plotted novel, though not without their share of pain. Inspector Craddock's swift action had seen Reginald Langley apprehended in London, his blackmail scheme laid bare by Nancy's tearful confession and the weight of evidence Miss Marple had so carefully gathered. The spectacle lens, the photograph in the hallway, the whispers of debts and discord, all had pointed to a truth that Mrs. Harrow had buried beneath her guilt and her curtains. She had admitted, in the vicarage's quiet parlor, to administering what she believed was a sedative to her husband, at Langley's urging, only to learn too late that it was a poison that stopped his heart. Her seclusion had been her punishment, a self-imposed exile from a world she feared would judge her. Miss Marple, walking slowly back toward Raymond's bungalow, reflected on the complexity of human motives. She thought of a woman in her own village, years ago, who had locked herself away after a betrayal, her curtains drawn not against the world, but against her own shame. "People are so very much alike," she murmured, her gloved hands clasped around her handbag. "They hide, but the truth has a way of finding the light." At the bungalow, Raymond and Joan were waiting, eager for the final chapter of what Raymond had dubbed Aunt Jane's Village Adventure. Over tea in the bright sitting room, Miss Marple recounted the resolution with her usual economy, her voice soft but precise. "So it was blackmail all along," Raymond said, shaking his head. "Poor woman, living in fear of that Langley fellow. But why didn't she go to the police years ago?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Guilt, my dear, is a powerful jailer. Mrs. Harrow believed she had caused her husband's death, however unwittingly. To her, those curtains were a shield, not just from Langley, but from her own conscience." Joan, pouring more tea, shivered slightly. "It's so sad, Aunt Jane. All those years, alone in that house, paying for a mistake. Will she be charged, do you think?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Inspector Craddock believes not. The evidence against Langley is strong. His intent was clear, and Mrs. Harrow was more victim than villain. She'll face questions, of course, but I suspect the law will be kind. The greater punishment has been her own." As she spoke, her gaze drifted to the window, where the village green lay peaceful under the fading light. She thought of Nancy, who had returned to the cottage to stand by her mistress, her loyalty unshaken even by the truth. She thought, too, of the photograph in the hallway, the man who was not Mr. Harrow but Langley, a relic of a past that had haunted Mrs. Harrow's present. The lens in the garden, Miss Marple had learned, was indeed Langley's, dropped during a heated confrontation with Mr. Harrow the day he died, a final piece of evidence that had sealed his fate. That evening, as she packed her small suitcase for the journey home, Miss Marple paused to look out at Linden Lane one last time. The cottage stood transformed, its windows open to the world, its secrets laid bare. Mrs. Harrow had taken her first tentative steps toward redemption, attending church that morning for the first time in years, her face pale but her head held high. The village, ever quick to gossip, would soon find new tales to tell, but Miss Marple hoped they would be kinder ones. "Aunt Jane," Raymond called from the doorway, "you've done it again. Solved a mystery no one else even saw. You ought to write a book about it." Miss Marple chuckled, folding her knitting into her bag. "I leave the writing to you, my dear. I'm content to watch and listen." The world is full of stories, if you know where to look. As she boarded the train the next morning, the countryside rolling past in a blur of gold and green, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Mrs. Harrow. The widow's curtains were open at last, and though the road ahead would not be easy, there was hope in that small act of courage. For Miss Marple, it was enough to know that the truth, however painful, had set one soul free. And as the train carried her back to her own quiet life, she smiled, certain that other puzzles awaited, as they always did, in the hidden corners of human hearts.